When my own mother paid my boyfriend to break my heart, I thought that was the worst she could do. Turns out that was just the opening act of her twisted show. She'd been controlling every part of my life, sabotaging friendships and relationships right under my nose. But here's what happened when I found out the truth and turned the game back on her. My name's Sarah, I'm 27, and honestly, my mum Linda, who's 52, has always been, let's say, a special case. Growing up, it always felt like I was some kind of science project for her, one she was determined to sabotage. She had this endless list of criticisms and a constant need to control everything around her. And I mean everything. I thought I knew how far she'd go to keep that grip on my life, but I had no idea. It all started when I met Mike, my first serious boyfriend in a long while. For once, I thought maybe she'd be happy for me. Maybe she'd lay off with the, "Sarah, you need to find a decent guy" speeches. But, as always, I should have known better. Her support wasn't support at all. It was just another act in her twisted play. From day one, Linda kept telling me Mike wasn't good enough and that he'd betray me eventually. Every chance she got, she'd throw in another reason why he was wrong for me. Sure, I ignored her at first. I mean, come on. It's not like she'd ever approved of anyone in my life. But then, out of nowhere, Mike did betray me. He cheated on me with some random girl, leaving me totally shattered. Now, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Just a horrible experience I'd move on from eventually. But the truth? It was so much worse. Turns out, Mike hadn't just randomly decided to betray me. Nope, my own mother had actually paid him to do it. She wanted to prove that I wasn't worthy of real love. After Mike's betrayal, I was honestly at rock bottom. I mean, this wasn't just any heartbreak. It felt like my entire self-worth had been dragged through the mud. I was humiliated, lost, and barely hanging on. Meanwhile, my mum Linda seemed to be enjoying every second of my misery. Every time I tried to talk about how crushed I was, she'd get this little smirk on her face, like my heartbreak was her personal victory. I kept asking myself, why on earth would a mother enjoy seeing her daughter go through this? But then again, Linda was never like other mums. Empathy was about as foreign to her as a vacation to Mars. One day, while I was out with some mutual friends, I overheard a snippet of conversation that made my blood run cold. Someone mentioned that Mike had made a decent bit of cash out of our breakup. At first, I just brushed it off as gossip. But then, my brain started connecting the dots and a sick feeling crept in. Could it be that Linda was actually involved? No. That had to be impossible, right? I needed to know, so I took a leap and messaged one of my ex-boyfriends. I know, bold move, but I had to get answers. To my horror, he replied almost immediately, confirming it. My own mother had paid him to date me and then break up with me, just to prove a point. Apparently, she'd even given him guidelines for how to handle the relationship. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. At first, I thought he was joking. This had to be some twisted prank, right? But the details he shared, they were too specific to ignore. Every word, every sentence just dug the knife deeper. My emotions were all over the place. Rage, disgust, and heartbreak colliding like a storm inside me. But something inside told me this was only scratching the surface. If Linda was capable of doing this, then what else was she hiding? It took me days to gather the courage to confront her. I mean, days. I rehearsed everything I was going to say at least 100 times, imagining how it would go. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. When I finally looked her in the eyes, every nerve in my body was screaming to back down, but I couldn't let this slide. So, I took a deep breath and went straight to the point. "Mum, did you actually pay my boyfriend to break up with me?" She didn't even blink. Not a single ounce of shock or denial. Instead, she just gave me this tiny smirk, like I'd just asked her if the sky was blue. Oh, Sarah, she said, almost rolling her eyes. Of course I did. You do know all men are cheaters, right? I was just making sure you learned that before you got too attached. I couldn't believe my ears. She said it so casually, like we were discussing some recipe she'd found in a magazine. I felt my fists clenching, my whole body vibrating with anger. This was her idea of a life lesson, sabotaging my relationships just to teach me something? You paid him to break my heart, I practically shouted, barely keeping it together. My voice was shaking, but she didn't even flinch. She just looked at me with this maddeningly calm expression, like she was some wise guru passing down life advice. Sarah, she sighed, I did it for your own good. I thought you'd be smart enough to understand that by now. I mean, honestly, I was protecting you. Better to learn it now than get hurt later in life when it really matters. The coldness, the complete lack of remorse, it was terrifying. It hit me right then and there that this wasn't just some tough love thing. This was a game to her. She was so wrapped up in her twisted little lesson that she didn't care how much it hurt me. I was speechless, just staring at her, trying to understand how my own mother could be so heartless. But she didn't even care. She just kept going, talking about how I needed this and how I'd thank her one day. There was nothing protective about it. It was all about control, about proving some weird, warped point she'd decided was her mission. And in that moment, I realised that to her, I was nothing more than a pawn in her own twisted, cynical game. After that confrontation, everything started to click into place. It was like someone had ripped off this thick, foggy layer, and now I could see everything clearly. I sat there, replaying scene after scene from my life, and it was like watching a horror movie where the villain had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. The worst part? The villain was my own mother. I started thinking back to all the friendships that had just fizzled out for no reason. There were people I genuinely liked, people I'd clicked with, but somehow I'd always end up isolated, doubting myself, wondering what I had done wrong. I used to think, maybe I'm just not cut out for close friendships. But now, every single memory felt tainted, like it was soaked in her manipulation. There was this one friend, Emily, from high school. We were inseparable. She was the one person I could talk to about anything, and I'd honestly thought we'd be friends forever. Then, out of nowhere, she just stopped talking to me. I was devastated, confused. I remember asking my mum about it, and she just shrugged and said, well, maybe Emily's family doesn't think you're a good influence. At the time, it hurt, but I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my mum. She was supposed to know what was best for me, right? But now, with everything I knew, I started to wonder if she'd had something to do with it. Maybe she'd planted those seeds, nudging Emily's family to see me in a different light, feeding them subtle little comments until they thought I was trouble. It was like realising I'd been living in this fake world she'd crafted just to keep me under her thumb. And it wasn't just friendships. I started thinking about all my past relationships too. Every breakup, every time a guy had ghosted me or suddenly decided I wasn't right for him. Had she been behind all of that too? Had she really been playing puppet master with my whole life, making sure I always came back to her, broken and alone? It was a brutal realisation. All these years I'd blamed myself, convinced that I just wasn't good enough, that maybe I was too difficult to love. But the truth, it wasn't me. It had never been me. It was her, pulling strings and poisoning every connection I tried to make. This wasn't just controlling behaviour. This was sabotage. She'd been deliberately creating this narrative that I was unlovable, unwanted, so I'd always stay dependent on her, always thinking she was the only one who cared. Sitting there, it felt like my whole life had been a lie, a twisted story with her at the centre, making sure I'd never feel truly happy or connected to anyone else. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't let her keep controlling me. Not anymore. Armed with the truth, I knew it was time to finally break free from Linda's twisted grip. There was no way I was keeping all of this to myself anymore. I'd spent years suffering in silence, thinking it was all somehow my fault. But now I wanted everyone to know the real story. I started small, telling my closest friends. They'd seen pieces of it over the years, the weird ways my mum would try to help me, or how she always had something negative to say about anyone I got close to. When I finally laid it all out for them, their faces said it all. Shock, disbelief, and then the anger. My best friend, Katie, was the first to speak up. "Sarah, that's messed up on a level I can't even process. And this whole time, you thought it was you." Hearing it from someone else was weirdly validating. Like, yeah, it was messed up, and no, I hadn't been imagining it. My friends were horrified, but their support gave me the courage to take it further. Next step, family. So, I bit the bullet and told a few family members. Honestly, I expected them to brush it off or make excuses for her. But as I told them each little piece of the story, how she'd sabotaged my friendships, ruined my relationships, even paid people to break my heart, something started to shift. People began to listen, really listen. Some were shocked, like they'd just discovered some hidden chapter of the family history they'd been blind to. Others, they were angry, and rightfully so. Then, just like that, the word spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the family gatherings, the neighbourhood gossip, even our extended family group chats, all of it was buzzing with stories about Linda's parenting methods, her so-called perfect reputation, that carefully crafted image of the devoted mother who only wanted the best for her daughter was cracking wide open. At first, she tried to act like it was all some ridiculous misunderstanding. "Oh, Sarah's just going through a phase," she'd say, with that same little dismissive smile. But nobody was buying it anymore. The more people talked, the more her true colours showed. Her attempts to paint me as the problem child were backfiring spectacularly. People started seeing her for who she really was: manipulative, controlling, and completely obsessed with having everything her way. The whispers turned into rumours, and the rumours turned into something bigger. It was like a domino effect. Suddenly, people who'd always admired her from afar were looking at her differently, questioning every story she'd ever told them. Every single attempt she'd made to make me look like the bad daughter was now being dissected and seen for what it was, a way to cover up her own toxic behaviour. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was free from the version of me she'd always tried to push. With each person I told, it was like I was reclaiming a little piece of myself, like I was finally allowed to be my own person without her constant shadow. And the best part? She was losing everything she'd worked so hard to build, that pristine image, that perfect reputation. Now, all anyone saw was the truth. Once the truth was out, Linda knew her little empire was crumbling. It was written all over her face the last time I saw her. She looked panicked, desperate, like someone who just realised they were no longer in control of the game. For the first time, it hit her. She'd lost her grip on me, on everyone. And now, she was scrambling to save face. Out of nowhere, she started blowing up my phone with these long messages about how it was all a misunderstanding. Apparently, I'd taken things the wrong way, and, of course, she was just looking out for me. Really, Mum? Was she really trying to spin all her years of manipulation as some twisted version of motherly love? She even threw in that classic line, "I was only doing what I thought was best for you." I didn't bother responding, not a single word. I was done with her excuses. After everything she'd done, the last thing I needed was to hear her try to rewrite the past, making herself the hero in her own story. I'd already moved past that, but Linda wasn't about to give up. When I ignored her texts, she went into overdrive, reaching out to our family friends, trying to pull them back to her side. She called it a big misunderstanding, a miscommunication. But everyone could see right through her act now. She'd spent years manipulating people to keep them on her side, and now they finally knew who she really was. I went to each of those family friends, those people who had always admired her, and shared the whole story. Every painful detail, every bit of manipulation, every lesson she'd tried to teach me by sabotaging my happiness. By the end, no one was giving her the benefit of the doubt anymore. They saw her true colours, and it was like this invisible barrier around her had finally shattered. Family events? Forget it. Linda found herself cut off. People stopped inviting her to gatherings, stopped checking in on her. She'd built her life around being the centre of attention, the perfect mom everyone looked up to. And now, she was standing alone, watching her carefully crafted image fall apart piece by piece. Her grip, her influence, her control, it was all gone. And without it, she was left with nothing. For the first time, Linda was powerless. The one thing she'd always cared about, her control over others, had slipped right through her fingers. And for me, that was all the payback I needed. With the truth out in the open, Linda found herself in a place she'd never expected. Total isolation. Everyone who used to look up to her, respect her, or even consider her a friend, had drifted away. All the family friends who once thought she was this picture-perfect, supportive mom wanted nothing to do with her. It was like her whole social circle had evaporated overnight, leaving her to pick up the pieces. Linda tried everything to patch things up. She'd pop up at community events, giving people that practiced, sweet smile of hers, acting like none of it ever happened. But people didn't see her the same way anymore. To them, she wasn't the concerned mother or the helpful neighbour anymore. She was the woman who'd spent years manipulating her own daughter's life to suit her twisted version of parenting. People couldn't just unknow that. And you could see it on her face, that mix of shock, fear, and for the first time, maybe even a little regret. It was almost surreal, knowing that the same woman who once acted like she owned the world now looked lost. Every time she'd pass someone who used to be her friend, they'd glance away or give her that awkward half nod, letting her know they didn't buy her act anymore. She'd built a life around her reputation, around that image of control. And now? It was all slipping through her fingers. Linda tried reaching out to old friends, digging into her contact list to find anyone who'd still talk to her. She'd call them up, leaving these long-winded voicemails about misunderstandings and forgiveness. But one by one, people just stopped picking up. No one was interested in hearing her excuses. Why would they? Everyone could see now that Linda wasn't just a little overprotective or misunderstood. She was someone who'd systematically torn down her own daughter's happiness, all for her own satisfaction. With every ignored call and awkward brush-off, it sank in deeper. Linda was alone, and there was no one left willing to put up with her games. She'd built her whole life around controlling others, around twisting the truth to keep herself on top, but now? She had no one to control, no one to manipulate. The walls she'd built to protect herself had turned into a cage, leaving her exactly where she'd tried so hard to put me, completely isolated, with no one left to lean on. And for Linda, that was her worst nightmare come true. Finally, I was free. Free from Linda's shadow, free from her toxic grip on my life. It felt like I could actually breathe for the first time. For so long, I'd lived in this bubble where every decision, every friendship, every tiny bit of happiness had to pass her silent, judgmental approval. But now, all of that was behind me. Once I was out of her reach, it was like I could finally see myself clearly. I started realizing that my worth, my value, had never depended on her twisted opinions. All those years of feeling not enough or thinking I had to earn love, They were lies she'd planted just to keep me wrapped around her little finger. And without her voice in my head, I started to see myself differently. Like, for the first time, I could just be me. No strings attached. I began reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years, friends who drifted away because of her meddling. Reconnecting with them felt like dusting off pieces of my life that I'd almost forgotten about. They welcomed me back with open arms, and for once, I didn't feel like I had to hide parts of myself or tiptoe around someone's expectations. With every reunion, every text, every laugh, I felt myself coming back to life. New people started coming into my life too. Real, genuine people who accepted me for exactly who I was. And it was weird at first, not feeling like I had to live up to someone else's standards, but I learned to embrace it. Slowly, I started letting myself trust people again, letting myself be open to relationships without that constant fear of judgment lurking in the background. As for Linda, she became a distant memory, a story I told only when I wanted to remind myself how far I'd come. She was left with nothing, no reputation, no power, and no one who cared enough to give her the attention she used to crave. Her carefully constructed world had collapsed, leaving her alone in the mess she'd created. And me? I was free to build a new life on my terms, surrounded by people who cared and finally living for myself.